All right, right now we about to tap in with Nancy E. Dewson. I'm hoping I'm saying that Deason, Deason. Probably fucking that up. It sounds kind of German yet Spanish. I don't know, but this is seeing the Indios in 16th century Castile. Um, this thing she wrote right here is amazing because to me it tells you how they came up with their little tactics that they brought to America whenever they first got here. Because you have to remember they didn't go to Africa first. You know what I mean? Well, they went to Africa first, but they already had that locked, and so there was no reason to bring anybody with you. Plus, these black Europeans already knew what they were going to go do. You know what I mean? They knew who they were already messing with through ancient ties of trading and whatnot. So they knew these people looked like West Africans. So their whole science was prove that you're not West African. You know what I mean? And this is the same science they used whenever they came to the Americas in court documents over and over and over again. This is how Indians were enslaved, changed to Negro, black, colored, etc. You know. Now you also do have some people that are truly mixed with African. I'm not gonna take that from you. If that's your bloodline, God bless you. You know, there's some people in my family, you know, because everybody doesn't have the same direct bloodline. You know, your uncle or aunt or may marry out, may choose a different lover several generations ago. So that does not make your cousin, or your family member. But when you're taking these supposed crazy ass DNA tests and you spitting in this cup, and a person tells you you got one match in Liberia or Freetown, you have to also remember what the ACS, an American Colonization Society, was. This was a conquest by Indians and the black Europeans on Africa. This is when Africa was invaded. You know, until this point, it was considered the no man's land. It was considered the white man's grave. We'll get into that also. You know what I'm saying? Because you would get over there and you would get sick because it's a whole new environment. Africa is different. You know, the earth breathes a different type of sulfur over there. They have certain spots in Africa that are uninhabitable. You can't go over there because it's sulfur comes up out of the soil. This would be almost like what they call moorland. You know, in Europe you have the same type of soil. In certain spots you can't plant shit. The soil is acidic, you know, and shit can grow there. So not to take away that they don't have plenty of trees, beautiful places to go. You know, my son's a quarter Liberian. Is no hate. I don't want people to ever think that this is a hate thing. This is coming from a place of disconnect, or that I don't, enjoy this dark skin, or that I want to be somebody I'm not. You know, I understand who my Sioux brothers are and what our ancient beef was, and how we ended up in the situation we're in now and selling each other out, and doing what we did to one another. You know what I'm saying? Is like they said, one drop of indigenous blood makes you indigenous, to the soil. So anybody I see who can break it down, pull out your family history, stand on it, be proud, I'm riding with you. You know what I'm saying? You my peoples, you know what I'm saying? Like this shit gotta change. I can't be having, people out here with the colorism and this and that and thinking they know, what this melting pot of America ended up being, because they chose not to read or understand for themselves. You know what I'm saying? I always said you want to hide the history from a nigga, put it in a book. And a nigga ain't always got to be a color. I want you to understand that. Certain motherfuckers just walk around here with the niggerisms on their mind. You feel me? Excuse my language. I hope they don't flag you for that. But that's just how they moving. You know what I'm saying? They with the isms. They with the bullshit. But let's get tapped in. It says, over the course of the 16th century, more than 2,000 people categorized as indios traveled to Castile, and a handful dressed in colorful regalia, wearing feather garments and bearing weapons, parades before royal officials, and posed for curious artists. Others came in an entourage of religious elite who sought diplomatic or political favor, retribution for those subjects, and the titles of the privilege from the kings. Europeans returning from the Indies share their ethnographic observation about the Indios and display artifacts from the Americas and stirred the culture's imagination of royal authorities and others. Of the Castilian royal court was a site where different visuals and living representation of the Indios from around the globe covered. How did the Castilians in the village and the cities grapple with the ethnographic observation of the returning travelers, the images of the feathered men and women of incredible tales they heard about the so-called brutish people? How did they reconcile the cultural imagery with the flesh and blood Indios in their midst? So, like you said, they had already had an idea of who they were fucking with, you know what I'm saying? But now they done brought them to their doorstep, and it's what they thinking. This book got a lot of great sources. We gonna get into those too. It says the majority of the Indios who appear in Castile did not carry spears or adorn their bodies with feathers. So you get why I'm saying they gave them a lot of bullshit to hype it up. You know what I'm saying? When they really was going over there to enslave, they knew that most of these was regular people, regular niggas. Let me put it like that. You know what I'm saying? So we'll get into Verrazano. We'll stop and see Verrazano scene. The majority of Indos superior in Castile did not carry spears or adorn their bodies with feathers. They were children and adult slaves and free people who wore tattered garments and performed grueling labor daily in homes, shops, and fields of the Castilian villages and cities. They did not journey to Spain as a part of a diplomatic entourage or living artifacts, but as the victims of a preposterous and active slave trade that should have come to a halt with Isabella's 1503 declaration that the Indios were free laborers and vassals. Yet the theologians and the jurists continued to debate the status of the Indios and their natural slaves as natural slaves. You hear what they saying? You know what I'm saying? They was hitting the courts about this shit. You feel me? Hundreds and thousands of the slaves and servants over the next 40 years were derecanted for their homeland. During the first half of the 16th century, indigenous children and adults were shipped as commodities throughout the Iberian colonial world. They served as military auxiliaries and exploratory venturers and domestic servants. In the case, often rebranded females, off-branded females as the partners of men who had raped, enslaved, and occasionally married them. Their monumental inter-America forced migration R 2000 made the transatlantic journey to leave their humble. Okay, okay, certain good sources down here at the collection of the American Indian artifacts in Europe. You can check that out. Collecting a New World. What else we got? Yeah, Hernan Cortez and the Aztec Indians in Spain. So you got when he brought people back. Okay, and then I gotta one second. Taken to Brazil regularly in 1557 for the next 50 years. However, the Americans continued to be the source of labor, even in the sugar industry, being only gradually outnumbered by Africans and American African mixed blood. In 1584, for example, the Pernambuco area has 60 or more sugar refineries. Com Milito Jean Barranca, Negros de Guinea, Indios de Terra, Bahia. He has some 40 refineries with Portuguese Indios de Terra and Negros de Guinea. To the south of Bahia, only American slaves were mentioned as forming the labor force in 1584, especially in the southern and northern parts of Brazil, São Paulo, and San Vicente, and Maranhão. And in the interior, the enslavement of Americans continued to be the major source of the labor for centuries. Between 1630 and 1650, for example, for 100,000 and 200,000 Americans from Paraguay region were enslaved and sold to Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and elsewhere. In 1570, the Portuguese crown attempted to limit the enslavement of the Americans to those captured in arms in combat of those from certain specified nations such as the Americas. In 1587, enslaved Brazos Americans were to be seen as free workers serving for terms, whether fixed or otherwise. In 1595, Philip II, ruler of both Spain and Portugal, prohibited enslavement except in war, which he declared none of these measures eliminated native slavery, however, and, and it increased greatly again during the 1630s under the conditions of the labor shortage. So you get see what I mean? Like they try to make it sound like when they went to Africa, they just went nuts. Like no, bruh. Like it was an excuse. You know what I'm saying? Like you bring over a couple Africans, and then you can say everybody's an African. You know what I'm saying? You get one mixed kid, you can say everybody's mixed. You know what I'm saying? This is the game they run. Under the conditions of labor shortage in Brazil after 1580, it would appear that the shipping of Americans to Portugal would have declined in significance, but we must keep in mind that the Portuguese had to have a way to pay for the African slaves, and also perhaps sometimes wanted to be rid of potentially rebellious Americans. C.R. Boxer noted that in the late as the 1719, the Portuguese of the Pao region were trading 3 or 4 redskins for 1 Negro from Angola in the area that the Americans were disliked and despised. It was people, therefore, that cheap American slaves captured in slave raids were sent to Africa and Portugal in exchange for Africans. So, where these people at today? And why don't the Native American blood pop up in Portugal? Why doesn't it pop up in Africa? Why isn't it, you know what I'm saying? There should be some long, deep genetic ties. Why is only the people on the east coast of America and Brazil popping up as all this European blood and North African blood? And everybody knows the North African invaded down into West Africa. You know, we all know how the mixing came out of that. So let's keep sliding down on them. You know what I'm saying? We were in 1580, in 1578, an Italian living in the Portuguese Empire wrote that the Brazilian natives were not then being imported into Portugal because of the Santo Gente Cativa e Argentino e como e se Pango Chevia se deliberano de morsi and vino loro fato. We must have reviewed this assertion as a obstinate of self-destruction within the context of continuing enslavement of hundreds of thousands of Americans in Brazil itself, as well as in the relation to possibility that the women and children might have been more easily transformed into slaves than were adult males. In any case, Chief Martin and Corgio's nation complained to the Spanish in 1576 that the Portuguese of southern Brazil were carrying their children off to other parts of Brazil and then to Portugal to be sold as slaves. A Jesuit witnessed in 1635 a slave freight using 15 seagoing ships and as many large canoes designed reportedly to secure 12,000 slaves from Carrillo nation. One must suppose that many were to be secure for the sale outside of Brazil. I think, be confident that Americans soon appeared in the Portuguese colonies in Africa and Cabo Verde Islands. The highest death rates on the Portuguese selling vessel. This high death rate on Portuguese sailing vessels of the period would make necessary that the replenishing of the crew in Brazil and somewhat later date the use of the Brazilian natives and mixed bloods in the African trade in various capacities, and may well be the Americans were introduced into the Portuguese African outpost soon as the 1500s. As noted above, uh, Farino de Nerhard were given a contract to ship slaves to and Brazilian wood from Brazil beginning in 1502. John Vaught states Nahua, or I don't know how you would say Narana, called Lorana during 1502/3, the merchant involvement with or like I said, St. George de Mina, St. George de Mina, which would be Ghana, including supplying all slaves and wine to the port. Simultaneously, Lorana held leases for Brazilians and Guyana pepper monopoly. Most of the slaves taken to Minia were gathered together on San Tome Island, but it seems highly likely that Namarama would have utilized some of the Brazilian slaves he acquired in his African activities, at the very least as mariners and laborers. A Brazilian scholar, Jose Horio, that's all conjecture, like you said, and shit like that. But they did because they were great sailors. We had said the Brazilian men came off the coast looking like they came from Hades. We'll find that too. Looking black as, you know what I'm saying? Okay. Uh, like they came from the sticks, hell, black as hell, is basically what he was saying. Brazil contacted the Greater Bond to Angola, the Dahomey, and parts of the coastal Mina and Guyana. Did Portugal itself, many Brazilians were to Angola as soldier, peddlers, bushmen, uh, prostitutes, and exiles. It will be very interesting to trace the first Brazilian American impact directly upon Africa, but doubtless it is more or less simultaneous with the first African impact upon Brazil. By the 1550, native Brazilians were in Portugal in some numbers, and at about the same time, the regular shipment of Africans to Brazil commenced. The Brazil and Africa trade was the first, went largely via Portugal, but gradually became direct. Portuguese vessels were noted to having crews of diverse nations and radical origins, from Madagascar to Japan crews. See what I mean? They had the Asian on that motherfucker jumping off. We keep on finding this Chino connection to Brazil. We ain't saying, we're not saying you're not indigenous or don't have indigenous blood in you, but just know that they've been letting the Asian off on both sides since I don't know when. So let's just keep it pushing. The crew is often African or Indian or South Asian origin, so not even, so this is dark. So we talking about the Philippines. We talking about your getting Negrito. Atlantic, we can assume the high portions were American background, just or percentages is not certain. Black African reach Mako and Japan in the 16th century in Portuguese ships, but it is also possible that few Americans or part Americans reached the east coast of Africa and then went as far east as Japan, drawing out the Portuguese in the Nagasaki. Show many Africans, but also freeborn men of possible Indian or Asian or American appearance, in early instances as persons of American ancestry, being in the Western Pacific, is seen in the case of the son of Juan Cavaro or Carlos, who was left behind on the island of Borneo near Bruni in July 1521. The father of a Portuguese accompanied Magellan had lived for 4 years in Brazil, and there his son had been born of an American mother. Certainly, Carvalho had taken the son with him to Europe, where both were later joined the Magellan expedition. Young Carvalho remained in Beneira, Barino after becoming lost, while his father remained in Malucas. All right, we're gonna rock with that. An interesting example of a person of American ancestry going with the Portuguese to Africa, India, and the Far East can be seen in the career of Antonio de Albuquerque de Carrillo, a Brazilian-born man who served as the governor of Macogaio in East Africa between 1700s and 1746. Albuquerque's mother, Angelique de Barrios, was from Pernambuco and had a white, Negro, and American Indian blood in about equal portions. The fact that he was of mixed race and born out of wedlock did not prevent Alberic's rise to fame and fortune. In his case, he was certainly not unique because of the rarity of the Portuguese women in Brazil. We must assume that high percentages of the Brazilians who later served in Africa and Asia were of least part American racial background. Some Americans were utilized as military auxiliaries to the Portuguese soldiers, as well as in 1641. Auxiliaries were to be sent from Bahia to Rio de Janeiro to reinforce the troops in Angola. And in 1644, the king approved a project to send Henrique Diaz, a non-white auxiliary from Bahia to Angola. Diaz was needed instead in Brazil to fight the Dutch, but in 1645 an expedition left Rio de Janeiro for Angola, and again in 1648 and 9, and some 2,000 men were sent from Rio de Janeiro to Angola. The Portuguese troops in Angola were accompanied in their campaigns by auxiliary and native troops, and thus we can be confident that the Brazilian contingents included persons of American origin. In 1650, Angola was virtually a colony of Brazil, and we can be sure that many persons of American ancestry went there in addition to the normal kinds of contact. Angola was used as a place for sending Americans and other persons who proved troublesome in Brazil and Korea. For example, mixed bloods and Americans undesirables were periodically rounded up and shipped off to Angola in 1720 onward. After about 1740, the island of Fernando de Noronha was also used as the dumping grounds of such people in the south of Brazil. America and non-whites were deported to Angola for gold smuggling or for using routes of passing through the region. Exposed to attacks by the American forces in 1720, it is quite early Americans were used in the settlement of Fernando de Noronha Island in 1602. A Portuguese man was residing on the island with 13 or 14 Negroes in 1612. A French vessel found only a Portuguese with a few Tupuyas and both sexes. The French removed the Americans to Marano. The Portuguese generally referred to the Tupi-speaking Americans of the coastal Brazil as Brasis or Brazilians, while the non-Tupi nations were often referred to collectively as Tupaias. Okay, well, let's get back over. We'll get into that back over that in a second. It said lives in Spanish kingdoms. Some came in with their masters, merchants, or seamen, who then sold them once they arrived in Seville. Once were siphoned through the illegal slave trade and eventually settled in the villages and the towns scattered throughout the kingdom of Castile. these locale slaves and servants from the locations as diverse as Peru to Bagu or Burma, people from the Portuguese domains who were also labeled Indios labored together in the interactions with other imperial Indios and with Castilians. These slaves globalized Iberia in both literal and conceptual ways. Venita Cerf had argued that to make all auxiliary familiar intelligible, it needs to be translated into categories that are commensable. This is no question that the physical presence of Indios toiling in the villages and the cities of Iberia aided in the mutual processes of sense making, but much of what we know about how the Indios were perceived and how the category Indios was constructed in the 16th century Castile comes through the study of legal and labor systems, of philosophical debate uh, over their status as vassals and consideration of political elites in Latin America. We have yet to probe further how elites and non-elite Castilians and Indios, free people, and slaves farm discourse about Indios that resonated with other uh, congruent practices of identification circulating in the 16th century and analysis in 123 litigation suits initiated by the Indio slaves of their own of their owners from thank you. Okay. You get the pro further and non-custodian Indio free people and current identity circulating in the 16th century analysis in 123 litigation suits initiated by the indigenous slaves of their owners from 1530 to 1585 before the Spanish courts and the House of Trades and the Council of the Indies revealed Castilians and individuals who identified themselves as Indios comprehending one another through a lexicon of themselves as Indios, comprehending one resemblance based on physiognomy, which included physical attributes in relation to geographical context, nation, and lineage, all means of freedom. So we're gonna get into that. We'll see if we can get that House of Commons, see what we can find. Says differentiation that had been employed throughout the Mediterranean for generations. The Castilians drew upon an extant vocabulary to assimilate Indios as already known subjects. Indios lived in Castile relied on the same lexicon to frame courtroom narratives about themselves, but in the wrangling invention and negotiation took place in the legal venue witnessed the litigations also transformed to discourse about what it meant to be an Indio, determining who Indios were and were not depended heavily upon the experience of witnesses, whether indigenous to Castilian male or female elites or non-elites. Some of those who testified had followed the compass and had actively engaged in the slave trade, while others remained in the global entreport of Seville, surrounded by foreign slaves from the Portuguese domains included Brazil, West Africa, and South and East Asia. So we talking about a bunch of Negritos, a bunch of niggas. So they all in that bitch. We got your Filipino Negritos, we got West Africans, and we got Brazilians, all sitting up there at Castile, and they like all y'all niggas. You know what I'm saying? You fuck what you talking about. At the end of the day, get your ass back in the field. That was the game. In addition, the Moros and the Moriscos of the Islamic converts to Catholicism from Magala and Barrio and elsewhere, we have to pay closer attention not only to the cultural experience of witnesses of our assessments of identity, but also to the particular bureaucratic and archival locus of uh, initiation, whether in lower levels or higher courts of inquisition or parish registers, which it is clear had a lot to do with how notions of differences were constructed. For instance, lots to do with how scholars have identified contact, such as the House of Trades and the Inquisitions were authority to scribe labels and descriptive phrases to identify passengers and uh, aspirant to positions who wanted to prove purity of blood in the increasingly uh, regimented way. But that does not mean that a blood of increasingly that does not mean that the Castilian, particularly those who had traversed the globe, identified the Indio slaves in their midst in the same way until 1508. They continued to depend heavily on physiognomic models to determine Indio's imperial status, nation, or lineage. The court recorded with clearly circumcised and formulaic and legalistic ways allow witnesses who were uh, less distance from litigants that the bureaucratic would be to speak about their notions of identity and identification than those of our uses of descriptions, particular color, to identify Indios and other require careful historical, geographic, and demographic contextualization in the bill of sales and the travel license that sold indigenous people into bondage and transported them across the Atlantic. Color was one of the most significant markers of the Indios identity, although we are now more sensitive to the complexities of the color also the markers of status. We should not assume that the 16th century Castilian notion of physical differences of body color were already immutable and that they remain stable in their transfer of vastly different contexts throughout the Latin America and in 16th century Castilian society, where individuals were identified and differentiated legally by noble commerce or slave status. Color descriptions such as black, Negro, white, Blanco, and Laurel used in travel documents and in bill of sales were considered synonymous for civil, if not slave status before the 16th century. The word esclavo was not always used to uh, qualify a person's legal status in bondage, but the color was in Seville and in southern Castile. Someone described as Blanco, or Blanco, my bad, in, in these particular documents was assumed to be a slave. The, wait, hold the fuck up. Described as Blanco in these particular documents was assumed to be a slave. These descriptors also serve as I have no idea, Sinadoche? Sindoche? I have no idea what that is. I'll have to look that up. For someone of the Muslim faith or a more, given the historical contingencies of when the military invasion occurred, when the slave trade expanded, and how the color coding of slaves developed. And it is understandable that litigants rely heavily on descriptors already in the use of identifying Indios by color in Castilian courts, like pre 1492 Mediterranean vocabulary. The description of Indios found in many of the 123 litigation suits were malevolent and shifted over time, and both indigenous litigants and slave owners strategized and manipulated those constructs and influenced the outcomes of each lawsuit. The assessments of Indios identifying these places in 16th century Castilian courts highlights what some Latin Americans and Iberian scholars have been arguing: we need to unfix race as a construct to explain how colonial vassals were free or enslaved or distinguished from one another in the 16th century. Others disagree with the assessment and nor a hardening of racial or proto-racial labels during the time. An analysis of these litigation suits begs scholars to examine more carefully the processes of identification taking place in different contexts and documentaries in Loki, and not to assume an Iberian set of fixed, stable descriptors related as enslavability and identity. The litigation suits demonstrate the color was one of the several physiognomic determinants used to identify the individual's characteristics of an Indio held in bondage, which included a slave of a permanent laborer called a Naburi, Nabaria, and who was not free to travel of his own or her own violation to draw up a will, simply put color, which is usually associated with the post 18th century conception of race, was not a sign of a fixed biological or cultural traits of groups of enslaved people in the 16th century. Color was a marker of an individual's humoral traits and status determined by context, demography, and increasingly after 1550 lineages as a lexicon for reading other physio, physiognomic, oh my, yeah, y'all get it, of which the coloration of which several uh, reliable aspects are distinguished of categorized sometimes arbitrarily and politically different enslaved individuals for the purpose of discriminating against them or providing them with a legal protection. The criteria used to determine the identities of the Indios as slaves also depended on specific historical, which included the religious faith, the the validity of their slave trade, the changes in litigations that limited or prohibited enslavement under certain conditions. The first, I don't know what that is, paramount to the social status of the position of the old Castilians, and generally what comes to mind when we think of categories of difference and auxiliaries they created in late 15th and 16th century Castile. Some have argued that because physical differences among Jews, Muslims, and Castilians were minimal, genealogical uh, investigations into the lineage of conversos. Jews convert to Catholicism and Moriscos because compulsory, perhaps. Nowhere are the tensions more probable than in restrictions implemented by the House of Trades. The authorities interview, interview potential immigrants and probe genealogies and detect purity of blood. Limpieza de Sangre, and in principle allowed old Castilians to cross the Atlantic. Old Castilians, I've heard that before. So that'd be your Moors. So basically, I think if the purity of Moor. So if you have Moorish blood, you could cross the Atlantic. So that would be why Christopher Columbus and them were allowed to go. Not only did Christian heritage determine status, position, and the ability. Oh no, they said if you had any Moorish blood, I don't think you're allowed to go. I'm about to check into that. And the ability to mitigate confessions, faith, and had centuries been the region that's some type of Spanish. I got to roll with that. In Christian Iberia for the enslavement for non-Christians, enemies dwelling in the land, not subject to the Christian rule, infidels who once captured were labeled as captives of just war, and several scholars have shown identifying the jurisdictions of such captives could be strategic and calculating. In the 1440 slaves who were battered or purchased in retarded, bartered or purchased in the Portuguese territory designated as Guyana were privately conflated with so-called infidels, Moors, or just their enslavement as captives of just war. We see the same modus operandi with the people of the Canary Islands, and as soon thereafter in America with Isabella. I determined that the neophyte Indios of the King of Spain were rationally capable. They had in Ingenio and I know what that word is. Capital. That was something that has to do with legal terms or understanding Christianity and could not be captured as infidels. Resistance to Catholicism was not, however, the main driving force in the enslavement of the Indios in Spanish America, as a number of studies on the indigenous slavery has shown a lack of clarity in the Crown's policies meant that the Indios could be enslaved in cases of cannibalism. And what they kept saying, yeah, cannibal Pequots, your cannibal mosquitoes, your cannibal Brazilians, cannibal Negroes, your cannibal Arawaks. You know what I'm saying? And all these people ended up, the Goulet, it became your Gullah Geechee. These people were all called cannibals. So you see how they pulled that one out. Just start digging through your cannibal Indians and you'll find out who your Negro tribes are. Because they always said they ate somebody if they was Negroes. Alright, let's keep it pushing. Um, Resistance to Catholicism or military incursions in 1504 rescate or the exchange of Indios already enslaved during the next 40 years, such as Carte Blanche exceptions to serve as routes to enslave hundreds of thousands of people from the Americas and elsewhere. Even the new laws of the 1542, which abolished slavery in most instances and provided the legal cornerstone for the Indio slaves who litigated in Spanish courts, still did not guarantee a successful outcome and would take several more decades after the passage. The new laws before Castilians would cease to equate the category of Indios with permanent bondage when it became clear that Charles V, that the resistance to the imperialization of the new laws in Spanish America would be formidable. He decided to begin at home in Castile in several inceptions that occurred in 1543 and in 1549 resulted in more than 100 indigenous slaves being freed, and the plethora of lawsuits that ensued, generally initiated by disgruntled slave owners, witnesses, especially those of indigenous heritage, pointed to this period as transformative. Although the Indios justifiably feared the repercussions of stepping forward to petition for their freedom. Many did so, and the word spread quickly among the Indios living throughout Castile, but it was rarely easy or straightforward, and litigants were beaten, branded, and sold. What they tell niggas happened to them? The stakes were high for both masters and slaves. Thus, the courtroom became a site where Indios and the masters purposely manipulated descriptive physiognomic categories and abstract notions to belonging to their attempts to fix Indios as a particular slave or to liberate them from decades of bondage. Determining their status was rarely straightforward, and it took years of protective legislation to be implemented seriously and systematically in Castile. Faced with increasing legal restrictions after 1542, slave owners in Castile developed two strategies that aided in identifying their Indios as slaves. The first was to argue that their Indio slaves did not in fact originate from a domain under the control of the Indies of the ocean sea of the King of Spain, rather that they were Portuguese vassals who were by law still considered slaves even after political unification of the Iberian Peninsula in 1580. The second line of attack was to emphasize the lineage of the slaves over his or her place of birth, naturalizia. This meant that in some cases, Indio litigants were being asked to prove that their mothers were not of Moorish or North or West African heritage, because the slave owner generally did not have documents to prove that the slave had been captured in just war. Acquired after 1536, the Indios had difficulty proving their place of origin or who their mothers were. Litigants of defendants relied on expert witnesses to identify the imperial status of lineage of each Indio litigant. They also relied on bills of sale and travel documents that included geographic and physiognomic descriptions, which were used to strengthen their case for continued bondage or freedom. These records show that although witnesses, plaintiffs, and defendants might have wanted to essentialize the Indio litigants, that the purpose of manipulation of those descriptors used to identify Indios in the documents and depositions was by no means standardized or fixed. In short, courtroom evidence did not point to any sense of reductive biological inalienability of Indio-ness. So, like, you a nigga still, till otherwise, you feel me? Like, if you can prove that you wasn't a nigga, they all, let's go to Verrazano. Let's just find Verrazano's book. Let's see. With the consider. Come on, man. With the considerations, we may consider that the authenticity of Verrazano's voyages sufficiently established for our purpose of many proceed to the examination of the relation of sailing from the deserted islands of what is that? The Maritas. Verrazano first made landfall at latitude 34 north, finding a low-lying coast with no harbors. After sailing to the to the south for some 50 leagues, 159 nautical miles, he turned to the north to avoid the Spaniards and made port at his original landfall, where he found that natives go nude of everything except that at the private parts. They were some skins of little animals like martens, a girdle of fine grass woven with various tails of animals, which hang around their body as far as their knees, the rest nude, and the head likewise. Some wear certain garlands of feathers or birds. They are dark color and not much unlike the Ethiopians, and their hair is thick and not very long, which they tie together back on their heads, in which the shape of little tails, of a little tail. As to symmetry of a man, they are well proportioned and medium stature, rather exceed us in the breast. They are broad, their arms are well built, and their legs and other parts of their body are well put together. There is nothing else except that they incline somewhat to broadness in the face, but not all, for in more we saw that the face clear cut, the eyes are black and large, and they glance intent and quick. They are not of much strength and craftiness, acute, agile, and great, and the greatest runners. It is near the land in which the name Anacita from the day of arrival Verrazano found the isthmus, a mile in width, about 200 long, in which from the ships were seen the Oriental Sea between the west and north. We navigated along the isthmus, which the colonial hope of finding some strait of true prom, prom, promontory, and which the land would end towards the north in order to be able to discover the name Isthmus Verrazano, and all the land found the name Francisco for our Francis. Proceeding northward from the isthmus, which was undoubtedly the Carolina Cape, the expedition came to another land which appeared much more beautiful and full of the largest forests. The natives were here found to be lighter colored than those parts, dressed in certain grasses which grow pendants from the branches of trees, and the weave of various ends of hemp, the head bear in the same form as the other. Their foods are general is the pulse, for which they abound, differing in color and size from others, of excellent detachable flavor. About the hunting, fishing, and birds, which they take with bows and with snares they make of tough wood, and the arrows of reeds, placing the extremities, bones of fishes and other animals, the beasts, and the parts are much wider than in Europe, because they are continually molested by the hunters. We saw many of their barges constructed from a single tree, 20 feet long, 4 wide, which are not fabricated with stone, iron, or other kinds of metals, because in all the land in the space of 200 leagues, which we travel, only one stone is of any species was seen by us. The aid themselves with fourth elements, burning such part of the wood as suffice to hollow out the barge, also the stern and prow, so that the navigating the possible to plow the waves of the sea. So so they made a motherfucking sail. So the boat had a sail on it too. Let's see, I might have a picture of the sails. One of those carrier boats.
Native Americans in suburban Slidell, Louisiana, were ignored. Just like it looked the day after the storm. So what are we calling recovery? Really what it looked like to me, they have gotten rid of their poor, unwanted citizens and have ditched them off on other cities and have no intent on bringing them back. None. Difference with us. You don't have to bring us back. We're coming back. Elwyn Warhorse Gillum is the chief of the Choctaw Indian tribe. When Katrina arrived, Gillum and part of her tribe fled to Arkansas. The chief is fighting now to bring her tribe back to Louisiana. My people have been here forever. This is home. This is my motherland. My burial grounds are here, not too far up the road. I tend the burial grounds, me and my family. Most of my history is passed down to me with that tree right there. The things I lost money came. I lost the tree. I lost my animals. The old cypress still made it. I love that cypress tree. My grandfather always would tell me about that cypress, never cut that cypress. And the storm didn't even take it down. We're going to have to heal ourselves just like this tree does. Rudy Macklin is the director of the Office of Minority Health in Louisiana. The storm didn't even take it down. We're going to have to heal ourselves just like this tree does. Rudy Macklin is the director of the Office of Minority Health in Louisiana. He's trying to help Warhorse and the Choctaw return to their homeland.
She is having a problem with her tribal members. So she calls me up. She said, hi, Rudy Mack? I said, yes. She said, this is Chief Warhorse. I said, okay. She said, I'm with the Choctaw tribe. I said, Choctaw tribe? I said, I have a listing of all the Native American tribes, and I don't see Choctaw. She said, there's a reason for that. I said, oh, really? She said, well, kind of the last of the Black Indians. I said, Black Indians? I said, wait a minute. I remember in the past hearing of some Black Indians in history lessons, things like that. She said, oh, yeah. She said, we're the Choctaw tribe. We're in Slidell. I said, Slidell? Said, oh.
Macklin wasn't the only one who wouldn't recognize the name of the Choctaw tribe. For the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Chief Warhorse and her tribe do not officially exist. They're not entitled to federal support. We are punished today because we helped free slaves, okay? If my tribe never helped to free slaves, they may never would have bothered us. If we would have just continued helping Europeans as they came in, we were fine. But when we decided to help the slaves, now we did something wrong. So that's why I don't have my recognition today. At the beginning of the 18th century, runaway African-American slaves sought refuge with the Choctaw, and eventually the two tribes...
Christopher Columbus is not our origin. Africa is not our home. Indians for you.
Welcome to the Aboriginal channel. On this episode, we're going to be showing Deontay Wilder a little bit about who he is